He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. Let's get the production details out of the way quick because I really want to tear into the meat of this one. First, praise the maker, Brian Ching is back in the interior artist chair, and here he is going to stay for the rest of KOTOR the comic. Granted, we're only 6 issues out from the conclusion, but hey, he's the best artist in this series, I'll take what I can get. Meanwhile, Benjamin Carré does the cover art for Part 1, while Part 2 is done by Jim Pellevac, whose art quality is almost as good, if not on par with Carré's. So, that's all done. Let's talk about the story. How to summarize Destroyer. The website TV Tropes has a page called Break the Cutie. The term describes a situation where the writer takes a character, usually someone naive, innocent, and/or likable, and then, over the course of a story, continue to crush and break them down. You destroy their spirit, kill their hopes, inflict one moment of misery and suffering after another until at last something breaks within them and they fall into a pit of despair. That character doesn't have to stay there forever. Sometimes they can claw their way out. But the point is, before they can build themselves back up, they must be broken down. That is what Destroyer is. A long, protracted break the cutie moment. And who is the cutie in question? None other than Zane Carrick, of course. This video is going to be relatively short, not just because Destroyer is only 2 issues and not because there isn't a lot to say, because there is. Because short of a 2-hour dissertation, there's really nothing I can say that can do this story arc justice. There are other arcs in the comic, like Commencement or Vindication, that are overall better stories, but more than any of the others in this 50-issue series, Destroyer is one that you really have to read for yourself in order to truly appreciate. And I really do recommend that any Star Wars fan read this comic in particular. Our story begins on the planet Volgax, amidst the ruins of a long-dead alien civilization, now used by the Crucible as a training ground for its slaves. As part of their latest plan to strike at the Crucible, Zane has disguised himself as a Republic fighter pilot and allowed himself and a salvaged fighter of his to be found by the Crucible. On him is a locator beacon. The idea is that he has to survive long enough for his friends and some muscle that they've hired to swoop in, take the Crucible by surprise, and break up this particular operation of theirs. Unfortunately for our young hero, Baranjar and Chantique, don't know why I've been mispronouncing her name up until now, are one step ahead of him. So why don't they just immediately clap him in a dungeon cell or just kill him? The reason is because while this is about eliminating a threat to the Crucible, for Chantique especially, this is about revenge against Jerael. Plus, she's a sadist by nature, as if her aesthetic wasn't already a massive giveaway. And she thinks that it would be better to have the young Jedi wannabe out himself before she can begin breaking him down. Initially, they go along with it, letting Zane get roughed up in a few fights, and then they throw some bait in his path in the form of one of the veteran slaves, Snout, a Kamasi of all things. This is significant for 2 reasons. First, while there are multiple pacifist races and cultures in Star Wars, the Kamasi are generally rated as one of the most famous pacifist species. As such, Snout serves as an example for how the Crucible is able to break down the will of its slaves and make even the most unlikely into fighters and killers. The second reason this is significant is because the Kamasi have a unique aspect of themselves called memness, or memni in plural. When a Kamasi experiences strong emotions, positive or negative, the memory of the event that causes these emotions is imprinted indelibly into their memory, like a perfect recall. Kamasi also have a kind of rudimentary psychic ability that enables them to pass on memni to other Kamasi, specifically someone who is related to them within 3 or 4 generations. However, because force sensitivity is somewhat similar to that, Snout is able to pass on his memni to Zane. And it's from this that we finally get some answers as to what the Crucible is and where it comes from. It turns out that the Crucible is ancient, over 1,000 years old in fact, originating during the Golden Age of the Sith. Originally the brainchild of one Ealdis, yes, as in the Helm of Ealdis from the Knight-Errant series, another comic by John Jackson Miller, as a way for the armies of the Sith to bolster their numbers by taking advantage of the death and destruction they cause. Any refugees from planets conquered and or devastated by the Sith, as well as prisoners of war, were given over to the Crucible, whose handlers would train them into being fighters while also breaking them mentally so that they would be obedient to their Sith masters and effectively used as shock troops. Originally confined to Sith space on the fringes of the Outer Rim, the Crucible spread into the galaxy proper during the Great Hyperspace War and has remained so ever since, up through to the beginning and after the end of the Sith War. Even after the Sith themselves were defeated, the Crucible carried on. In the absence of their Sith masters, they found other ways to support themselves, mostly by selling their slaves to unscrupulous markets. From sleazy sports organizations like the franchise, to shady mining operations like the Sungrazer Cooperative. Beyond the obvious cruelty and brutality of it all, the one thing that seems to disturb Zane the most about these revelations is the pointlessness of it all. The Crucible continues to capture slaves and turn them into fighters for a war that was lost long ago and for masters who no longer exist. Exar Kun was the last Dark Lord of the Sith, and he disappeared decades ago, while the old Sith Empire that created the Crucible in the first place has been dead and dust for a millennium. And yet the Crucible carries on, seemingly without purpose, seemingly content to do so without a purpose, turning prisoners into fighters, and some of those slaves, those who are ruthless enough to embrace the Crucible system, rise up through the ranks like Baranjar and Chantique to become the next generation of slavers, and so the cycle perpetuates. However, Zane's contemplation of the Crucible's seeming meaninglessness comes later. The more immediate problem he now has to deal with is the sheer trauma contained in Snout's mind. The Crucible are fully aware of the Kamasi's ability to share potent memories with one another. The comic does admittedly hand-wave away that 3 to 4 generation limiter I talked about earlier, but it is established on Wikipedia and in other Star Wars books featuring them that the Kamasi do a lot of intermarriage to make sure that as many people as possible can absorb as many memni as possible. The Kamasi possess a culture that values sharing experience with one another as much as possible. This means for the Crucible that every time a new Kamasi falls into their hands, they find the old Kamasi and force him or her to transfer their memni to the newcomer. By absorbing the memories of their predecessor, the new Kamasi absorbs both said predecessor's fighting experience and their mental trauma, all the memories of all the suffering they've endured. This is the reason why Snout is one of the Crucible's best fighters, because he has absorbed 1,000 years worth of combat experience. This also means that when Zane's mind makes contact with Snout's memni, the young former Padawan is exposed to 1,000 years worth of mental trauma and suffering. Honestly, it's amazing that Snout has any semblance of sanity after all that. At any rate, it proves too much for Zane, and he falls unconscious under the weight of mental suffering. Now that he's been properly softened up in body and in mind, Chantique decides that now is the time to begin working him over. Chantique's overarching goal is to get revenge on Jerael, and because of her sadistic tendencies, it's not enough to kill her. Chantique wants to make her suffer first. How better to hurt her then than by trying to turn Zane against her? After all, Zane is a Jedi. Jerael is a former slaver. How can there be anything even resembling friendship between these two? How can there be trust, given the stark moral dichotomy of their respective former professions? This is a potential crack in their relationship that Chantique can exploit. All she has to do is find the right way to drive a wedge into it. Zane awakens in her boudoir, for lack of any better term, and the Magister Impressor begins to work the young Padawan. First, by revealing that she and Baranjar knew all about his plan from the beginning, and they've deactivated his little locator beacon for the time being. So no one is coming to rescue him. Not yet, anyway. Then, when Zane protests the meaninglessness of the Crucible's violence, Chantique displays her full nihilist credentials by expressing the belief that violence doesn't need a reason, and that people who hide behind such things are hypocrites. And then she starts to work at undermining Zane's trust in Jarail. Those strange flame-like tattoos that are on her face and on Chantique's, these were written in an ancient language of the Sith, functioning almost like cognomens, usually given to Crucible overseers either by their superiors or by the slaves themselves. Our leading lady had been born Edessa, a name that we knew but Zane didn't all the way back in Knights of Anger. And according to Chantique, Jarail, the name that the slaves gave her, means the Destroyer. Zane resists these attempts at manipulation somewhat, but he's still clearly traumatized by the collective suffering of all the memories that he saw inside of Snout's mind. But it's around here that Chantique decides to tell him, and the reader, her backstory and her relationship with Jarail. The two of them were taken from the same place, a small education and training facility. Chantique was a few years older than everyone else, and it's noteworthy that the flashback shows that most of the other children were Arcanian offshoots like Jarail. For reasons we've yet to learn, her father deliberately sold her to the Crucible. Later, when these other students were also taken and placed under her control as their overseer, she apparently decided to take out most of her resentment on them. She was the overseer that Jarail challenged and fought and defeated to become the new overseer of this little group of slaves. And as Chantique reveals to Zane, Jarail did this by literally stabbing her in the back and leaving her to die. Now again, this sort of thing has been established as perfectly valid under the laws of the Crucible. Only strength matters. But it's clear that Chantique took this defeat very personal and views it almost as a kind of betrayal, which kind of shows you just how skewed her perceptions are. Thing is about the Crucible though, they don't have healers. They don't treat the injured among their ranks. I mean, those who are severely injured. They just get rid of them. So, for being beaten and being too severely wounded to just get better over the course of a few days, Chantique was sold into even worse slavery than the Crucible. It's not described, but it's heavily implied that she was some kind of sex slave, which is perhaps unsurprising, given that Zeltrons are known for being particularly attractive to a lot of humanoid beings. What she does reveal is that during her servitude, there was a point that she very much wanted to die. But instead, she discovered in herself power. The power to take back her freedom and kill her masters. For a while, she eked out an existence as a murderer on the Rim worlds, but eventually, to Zane's surprise, Chantique reveals that she deliberately returned to the Crucible. Mostly it was to get revenge on Jarail, but by then she'd already fled with Camper. Chantique decided to rejoin the Crucible anyway, and eventually rose to become Magister Impressor. She had become one of those slaves that had fully embraced the Crucible's worldview and its system. There are only two kinds of beings, those who get stepped on and those who do the stepping. And if you don't want to be the former, you have to be the latter. The flashbacks of Chantique's childhood show that she never was a very pleasant child to begin with. Her enslavement by the Crucible and by others had only made things worse by stripping out any semblance of empathy or kindness. Chantique is a being defined solely by spite, sadism, and a will to power. In her mind, the only proof that she isn't helpless is the fact that she demonstrates power over others every single day. She keeps trying to undermine Zane's trust in Jarail, and it seems to be working until something clicks in Zane's mind and he realizes the truth. This power that Chantique mentioned, that gave her the strength to heal herself and claim her freedom by killing her masters, was the Force. Chantique is a Force sensitive, although never schooled in formal training as either a Jedi or even a Sith. It's then that he realizes also that Chantique must have been the one who mutilated Gothar Klege by cutting off his head cones. With that realization, any kind of sympathy that Chantique may have aroused in him by telling him her story evaporates. But Chantique is undeterred and is confident that she will break Zane yet. And so, she pits him against Snout again. This time, the human and the Kamasi are to duel to the death. Meanwhile, back on the hot prospect, the signal from Zane's beacon has been dormant for far too long, and Jerael is nearly frantic with worry. Griff doesn't hold out much hope that the young former Padawan is still alive. In fact, he was very much opposed to Zane infiltrating the Crucible this way. You don't bait a trap with someone you expect to see again. At this point, the muscle that they've hired to help them hit the Crucible facility have left because the silence has dragged on for too long. At this point, they can't even turn to the Revankists and Malak for help, as they're too busy fighting the Mandalorians. Not knowing what else to do, Jerael seeks out LB. Given Zane's recent habit of trying to talk to the loader droid, she hopes desperately that maybe he knows something that can help them find Zane. At this point, it's still unclear just exactly how close Zane and Jerael are, though I'm sure comic fans were shipping them at least as far back as Days of Hate. But it is clear that she cares for him a great deal. He's the first person apart from Camper to learn about her past. Now that she's decided to confront her past and take down the Crucible, Zane has deliberately put himself in deadly danger for her sake. As it turns out, LB does have a solution, and puts Jerael almost immediately in contact with Shel Jelavan. But unfortunately, Zane's mysterious resources have to remain mysterious for a little while longer. For now, the story takes us back to Volgax and the upcoming duel between Zane and Snout. Under an ominous gray sky, everyone gathers to witness the mortal combat. And yet again, Miller delivers with some great dialogue. Zane insists that he refuses to fight, and Baranjar simply responds, "So you say, but the Crucible exists to find out what you will do. In the flames, a farmer can become Gothar Klege, a Jedi can lose his love for peace, and a Kamasi can become a killer." A good start, but then Miller surpasses himself by giving Snout lines that just drip with sadness and despair. Even as Zane continues to insist that there's still a way out for them, Snout knows there is no hope. Not for him. "My mind has cleared since you touched it. I understand the Crucible now. They are not criminals, and not an army. They are a remnant of something long gone. They are a machine, created by the Sith Lord Ealdis to turn subject peoples into strong armies. A machine that has never been turned off centuries after Ealdis turned to dust. The Crucible feeds on war, turning refugees into slave armies for whomever will pay. The stone does not care why it sharpens the sword. The Crucible's only aim is to go on. They will never let me go, never end my pain, not while my pain educates other warriors. I will never die until another Kamasi is kidnapped and made to take my burden." Zane throws his own knife away, insisting that the Crucible can't make the Kamasi do anything he doesn't really want to. To which the man once known as Ralthar Sitan, now called Snout, replies, "They can. They did. And I let them. I let them turn me against nature, Zane Jedi. I let them make me a fighter. So I will fight." The fight itself is brief and one-sided. Zane refuses to counterattack, and has very little chance at any rate against a veteran who possesses all the combat experience of his many predecessors. But then, just as Snout has the former Padawan pinned, Zane desperately trying to restrain his knife arm from stabbing him, the Kamasi suddenly pulls Zane's arm down towards him so that he stabs himself with his own knife. Desperately, Zane tries to heal him with the Force, but the blow was true and fatal. There is no recovering from this. And as Zane Carrick collapses beside the dead Kamasi, his spirit finally broken, Chantique puts the cherry on top by saying, "Meaningless, wasn't it?" And so the Crucible departs Volgax, moving their operations to one of their many secondary facilities across the galaxy, and leaving Zane behind with the dead body of Snout and his reactivated locator beacon. Bar and Jar would have rather kill the young Padawan, which would have saved them the need to move at all, but Chantique is fine with this outcome. Her objective in this endeavor was to take a first measure of revenge against Jarail. Her only regret is that she couldn't be there to see what comes next. Thanks to Shell's information and the reactivated beacon, the hot prospect finally locates Zane. A relieved Jarail runs out to meet him in the pouring rain, because of course let's milk as much melancholy out of this scene as we possibly can, and she finds her friend slumped beside a shallow grave dug for the dead snout. And then things break down exactly as Chantique had intended. For the first time since we've met him, Zane actually lashes out at Jarail. In fairness, he's clearly still traumatized by the Memni from Snout as well as the Kamasi's death and Chantique's manipulations, but that doesn't make what he says any less out of line or more hurtful. He asks how Jarail could ever even be party to all this cruelty, as if she had a choice in the matter. Why didn't she do more to try and help her fellow slaves, as if she could have? I freely admit that as I got to this scene, I began cringing inside as I knew what was to come. And I guess that shows just how emotionally invested I was in these characters that I was so reluctant to turn the page. Analyzing this scene also kind of demonstrates how clever Chantique was at setting this up. Even if she didn't know the exact nature of Zane and Jarail's relationship, she was smart enough to know Jarail would not have revealed her past to Zane, who was affiliated with the Jedi, unless he was someone that she cared about and trusted. In fact, she would never have revealed it at all if Gothar hadn't recognized her face tattoos back in Dueling Ambitions. And speaking of Dueling Ambitions, that comic actually shows why she wouldn't want to talk about her past. Out of fear that if Zane knew, he would reject her. In fact, he begins his tirade with the exact same words in her Nightmare Coom prophetic vision. How could you? Of course, Jarail calls him out on these unreasonable demands, and then sadly but bitterly concludes that if he's going to judge her like this, then there's really no point in them working together to take down the Crucible. Maybe it would be best if they go their separate ways. As she begins trudging back towards the hot prospect in the pouring rain, Jarail reveals that her name, the name the slaves gave her, means not destroyer, but protector. And it actually makes sense, and Miller even gives a clue to it in the name of the Magister Protector of the Crucible, Bar and Jar. Instantly, Zane realizes just how much Chantique had gotten to him, despite knowing that she was trying to manipulate him, but it's too late. Jarail's faith in him is now broken because he allowed himself to lose faith in her. And Chantique has gotten what she wants, at least for now. Slavery has appeared in multiple different Star Wars stories, but to my knowledge, no other storyline truly gets to the heart of why it is so horrible before I read Destroyer. When we think of why slavery is bad, we usually think of the obvious things. Lack of autonomy, the forced labor, brutal treatment, the outright dehumanization of its victims. But Destroyer is one of the few stories about slavery that addresses what has always lain at the root of such an institution. After all, even before people decided that slavery was a universal evil, no one ever wanted to be enslaved. Mind you, that didn't always stop them from enslaving others, but the point still stands. As such, slave revolts are almost inevitable, and the goal of every slave society, from Sparta to the antebellum South in America, to even modern slavery in parts of Africa and Southeast Asia. A crucial part of its function is preventing revolts and escapes from happening. As such, the core fundament of every slave system is to convince its victims that there is no way out, that they shouldn't even bother trying, that resistance is useless. And that is the true horror of the Crucible. That is why Snout ultimately killed himself. Sharing the Memni of every Kamasi that had passed through the Crucible's hands with Zane gave him the clarity to realize that terrible hopelessness, that there was no way out except death, that unless he killed himself, he would be kept alive until another Kamasi could be found and subjected to the same torments as he has suffered. Of course, he also knew that his death would hurt Zane as well, the only person who had offered any sympathy or kindness to him. It's why he apologized to the former Padawan before he killed himself. This story also brilliantly exposes what has been a perennial flaw of the Jedi Order since its beginning. This kind of cloistered ivory tower morality. A morality of which Zane is very much a product of. Prior to the Padawan massacre, he lived in the same kind of bubble as every other Jedi apprentice. Yet during the Covenant arc, his great strength was that he clung to his morals tenaciously in the face of a galaxy that seemed to have turned against him, where, with the exception of a few, everyone else believed that he had committed a horrible crime and wanted him dead. It was that same moral tenacity that allowed him to survive without compromising himself or stooping to the same level as the Covenant did. He never once allowed himself to believe, as they did, that the ends justify the means. But confronting something like the Crucible and Jerail's past is a situation where that kind of high-minded morality doesn't really work here. How quick we are to condemn others for things that we think we would never do. Make moral compromises that we think we would never make in their place. How easy it is to be a saint in paradise. And with that, we finally come to the home stretch. The final arc of the series, the third climax, and the final one, Demon. Until then.